The fluorescent lights of the Grand Lecture Hall at a prestigious university in Boston, Massachusetts, hummed with a quiet intensity. Professor Arthur Vance stood at the podium, adjusting his glasses as he looked out at the sea of over 200 students. Near the front row sat Julian Vance, his son and a brilliant ethics student. But my eyes were fixed on the screen from my seat in the very back. My name is Clara Sterling. I am 24 years old, and unlike the majority of my classmates who inherited their paths, I had to fight for every single inch of my education. I spent my nights working as a late shift data analyst, just to afford the tuition, while Julian enjoyed the effortless luxury of a legacy student whose father practically shaped the department. "Let us begin with a fundamental calculation," Professor Vance announced, his voice booming across the theater. Imagine a localized outbreak of a rare, highly contagious pathogen in a small New England town. As the chief medical officer, you possess a limited supply of an experimental antiviral. You can choose to administer the entire supply to save 5 patients who have a standard, moderate strain of the virus. Or you can use that exact same volume of medicine to synthesize a complex cure for one single patient, an eminent scientist who is on the verge of a breakthrough that could eradicate the disease globally. But in doing so, the 5 ordinary citizens will certainly die. He paused, letting the silence settle over the room. The numbers are simple: 5 lives versus one. The calculation of the greatest good for the greatest number seems obvious. How many of you would save the 5? Raise your hands. Almost every hand in the auditorium shot up, including Julian's. He looked back casually, a smirk playing on his lips as he saw the overwhelming majority agree. And how many would save the single scientist to preserve the future possibility of a global cure? Professor Vance asked. Only a small handful of hands went up. I kept my hand firmly by my side, choosing neither. Professor Vance pointed directly at his son. "Julian, defend the majority. Why is saving the 5 the mathematically moral choice?" Julian stood up, adjusting his designer blazer with practiced confidence. "It's a simple question of net utility, Dad. Sorry, Professor. You cannot morally justify sacrificing 5 distinct human lives, each with their own families and contributions, for a hypothetical future. 5 units of preserved happiness will always outweigh one. To choose the one is to allow personal bias to corrupt objective justice." The students around him nodded in agreement, murmuring their approval. Julian caught my eye from across the room, his expression dripping with the condescension of a man who believed he had just solved the universe's moral equation. "An excellent textbook utilitarian defense." Professor Vance smiled proudly, gesturing for Julian to sit. "But let us test the boundaries of that absolute calculation." The professor stepped away from the podium, leaning against the edge of the stage. "Now, suppose the scenario shifts. You are no longer dealing with a distant antiviral supply. You are a transplant surgeon in a major Boston hospital. You have 5 patients, each desperately clinging to life, each needing a different organ to survive: a heart, a liver, a kidney, a pancreas, and a lung. There are no donors available. But in the waiting room, a perfectly healthy young man, let's say a student who walked in for a routine physical, is currently taking a nap. You could quietly wheel him into surgery, harvest his organs, and save the 5 dying patients at the cost of his single life. The net math remains identical: 5 live, one dies. A collective murmur of discomfort rippled through the lecture hall. The hands that had been raised so proudly moments before remained tightly down. "What became of the calculation?" Professor Vance asked, his eyes scanning the quiet room. "Julian, does the principle of net utility still hold? 5 units of happiness against one?" Julian shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his confidence wavering for the first time. That's different. That involves an active crime. It feels categorically wrong to murder an innocent bystander who wasn't part of the equation." "But the outcome is the same, Julian," Professor Vance pressed, a sharp academic edge entering his voice. 5 families are saved, 1 is destroyed. If you truly believe that the morality of an action is determined solely by the net amount of good it produces, you must logically endorse harvesting the napping student. Julian had no answer. He sat down, his face flushing red as the room fell into a tense, unresolved silence. I leaned forward, looking down at my notebook where I had written a single phrase from the syllabus. Morality cannot be reduced to a spreadsheet. Little did Julian or his father know, our family was about to face a real-world calculation that no textbook could ever prepare them for. The theoretical debates of the lecture hall shattered into raw reality exactly 6 days later. It was a rainy Thursday night when the balance of our lives permanently shifted. Julian was driving his father's luxury sedan back from a high-profile university alumni gala in downtown Boston when he made a reckless, split-second decision to run a yellow light at an intersection. He broadsided a delivery van. The impact crushed the front of the sedan. But while Julian walked away with nothing more than a fractured wrist and minor bruising, the delivery driver, a 42-year-old father of 3 named Thomas, suffered catastrophic internal trauma. By midnight, Thomas was in the intensive care unit of the university's teaching hospital, clinging to life on a ventilator. I received the news because Thomas's wife, Elena, is my older sister. I rushed to the hospital, finding her collapsed in a plastic chair outside the ICU, her eyes red and hollow. The doctors were grim. Thomas had severe cerebral edema, brain swelling, and internal hemorrhaging. He needed an immediate, incredibly risky neurosurgery to survive, followed by months of intensive, highly specialized care. At 2 a.m., while I was holding my sister's shaking hands, I saw Professor Vance and Julian walk down the hospital corridor. Julian's arm was in a pristine white cast, and he was staring at the floor. Professor Vance looked pale, his usual academic composure entirely replaced by a tense, calculating panic. He didn't come over to comfort my sister. He pulled me into a quiet alcove near the vending machines. "Clara," Professor Vance began, his voice dropping to an urgent whisper. "The police are currently classifying this as a standard traffic accident, but they are looking into whether Julian was speeding. If this goes to a criminal trial, if Thomas doesn't pull through, Julian is looking at vehicular manslaughter. It will destroy his life. It will destroy his entire future before it even begins." I stared at him, my blood turning to ice. "Julian ran the light, Professor. He was reckless." I know," Vance whispered, glancing over his shoulder. "But let's look at this rationally, Clara. Let's look at the net outcome. The damage is severe. Even with surgery, his quality of life will be profoundly compromised. But Julian is on track to graduate top of his class. He has an internship at the Supreme Court lined up. He has a lifetime of massive societal contribution ahead of him." He stepped closer, his eyes pleading. "The hospital needs a $50,000 deposit for the specialized experimental neurovascular treatment. That might give Thomas a chance. A treatment insurance won't fully cover. My family will pay that entire $50,000 tonight out of pocket. We will fund Thomas's medical care fully." He paused, a heavy, transactional silence hanging between us. "In exchange, we need your sister to sign a formal affidavit stating that Thomas's vehicle drifted into the intersection, that it was an unavoidable accident. If the criminal charges are dropped, Julian can continue his career. If you refuse, we will tie this up in civil litigation for years. My lawyers will ensure your sister doesn't see a dime of settlement money until it's too late to help Thomas anyway. Think about the net utility, Clara. $50,000 saves your brother-in-law's life and it preserves Julian's future. It's the greatest amount of good for everyone involved." I stood there, listening to the man who had taught me ethics reduce my brother-in-law's survival, and a criminal cover-up to a calculated spreadsheet trade. He was using his wealth and legal leverage to force a grieving family into a corner, framing extortion as a moral compromise. "You have until Saturday morning to give me the signed paper," Vance said, squeezing my shoulder gently before walking away. Let's make the rational choice. I walked back to the ICU window, watching Thomas's chest rise and fall rhythmically with the machine. My sadness hardened into a freezing, razor-sharp clarity. I wasn't going to let them use their textbook philosophy to crush my family. I called my firm's trusted legal advisor and spent the rest of the night setting a trap. Saturday morning arrived under a thick, suffocating blanket of fog. At exactly 9 a.m., Professor Vance and Julian walked into the hospital's private family consultation room. Julian looked nervous, adjusting his sling, while his father carried the cold, corporate confidence of a man who believed his financial leverage had bought a flawless resolution. I was sitting at the center of the mahogany conference table. Resting face up in plain sight was my smartphone, its digital audio application actively recording every breath in the room. Clara, Professor Vance said smoothly, placing a certified cashier's check for $50,000 on the table. I trust you talk to your sister. We have the medical fund ready, and the hospital administration is prepared to fast-track Thomas's neurosurgery the moment we receive the signed affidavit. Julian stepped forward, looking entirely relieved. It's the most rational outcome, Clara. This money guarantees Thomas gets the best medical care possible, and it prevents a tragic accident from ruining another life. I looked down at the $50,000 check, then raised my eyes to look at both of them. Let's talk about net utility one last time, Professor, I said, my voice dropping into a dangerously steady low register. You wanted us to sign a fraudulent document to protect Julian from criminal manslaughter charges. You framed it as the greatest good, trading a lie for a life. Vance's smile faltered, his eyes darting to the phone on the table. Clara, we made a private, mutually beneficial arrangement to maximize. You made an extortion attempt, I interrupted smoothly, tapping the screen of my phone. I didn't spend the last 2 days convincing my sister to lie for you. I spent the last 48 hours delivering the dashcam footage from a nearby city transit bus directly to the district attorney's office. The footage clearly shows Julian accelerating through a solid red light while distracted by his phone. Julian gasped, the color instantly draining from his face. You destroyed my internship. You destroyed my entire career. No, Julian, I said, standing up to face them. Your own reckless actions did that. My family just refused to let you manipulate the truth to escape the consequences. Professor Vance slammed his hand on the table, his academic poise completely evaporating into raw, elite panic. Are you insane, Clara? Without this $50,000, your brother-in-law will not survive the week. You are actively choosing to let Thomas die just to satisfy a rigid, categorical moral pride. How is his death a better outcome? Because justice isn't a transactional spreadsheet, Professor, I replied, opening the door to the hallway. Standing right outside the door were two plainclothes detectives from the Boston Police Department, accompanied by David, a senior partner at a prominent pro bono medical advocacy firm I had contacted through my industrial design networks. This is David, I said, gesturing to the attorney. He has already reviewed Thomas's case. Because your son's liability is now an indisputable matter of public criminal record, the hospital's emergency board has legally approved Thomas's neurosurgery under their mandatory critical care policy. Furthermore, David is filing a fast-tracked frozen asset injunction against your estate this afternoon. The courts will be paying for Thomas's lifelong rehabilitation, not as a charity bribe from you, but as a legally mandated criminal restitution. The detective stepped into the room, holding out a warrant. Julian Vance, you are under arrest for dangerous operation of a motor vehicle causing severe bodily harm, pending further medical evaluation of the victim. I watched as the handcuffs clicked tightly around Julian's wrist. The practiced, arrogant composure of the legacy student and the elite professor completely shattered into naked, terrifying reality. They had spent their entire lives believing that rules were flexible parameters to be managed with wealth and intellectual justification. They truly believed they could calculate the value of a human life and buy their way out of accountability. They left the hospital in police custody, stripped of their reputation, their leverage, and their unearned immunity. 3 hours later, Thomas was wheeled into the operating room. The surgery was long and grueling, but he made it through. He has a long, difficult road of physical therapy ahead of him, but his vitals are stable, and his mind is entirely intact. Every evening after my shifts, I sit by his hospital bedside, holding my sister's hand as we watch the city lights of Boston flicker through the window. There are no algorithms here, no cold equations, and no calculated compromises. Just a family that refused to be crushed, anchored safely in a truth that no amount of money could ever buy.